Welcome to Sister Missing After Choir, a Miss Marple mystery. In the quiet village of Mary Mead, a simple choir rehearsal turns to alarm when a nun mysteriously vanishes. Beneath smiles and Sunday manners, Miss Marple senses something far darker stirring. So, where are you listening from tonight, and who do you think is hiding the truth behind the hymns? The evening had begun with such innocent charm that not a soul in Mary Mead could have guessed it would end in whispers of horror. The parish church glowed with the mellow warmth of candlelight, the faint scent of polished wood mingling with autumn rain drifting through the open door. The choir had gathered for their weekly rehearsal, a pleasant hum of chatter preceding the organ's first notes. At the back, Miss Marple sat quietly on one of the wooden pews, her knitting needles glinting in the soft light. She had come, as she often did, to listen to the music and observe the goings-on. Choir practice, she found, offered a rare glimpse into the temperaments of her neighbors who sought attention, who resented correction, and who tried too hard to appear humble. It was, she often said, a small but perfect mirror of human nature. That night's rehearsal was lively. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, bustled about with lists and hymn sheets. Young Nora Fielding giggled with her friend Ruth before being sharply hushed by Mr. Giles, the choirmaster. The sopranos were in high spirits, the tenors grumbled about cold draughts, and the altos argued about tempo. It was, in short, the sort of mild chaos that made village life endearing. By 9 o'clock, the hymns had been sung, the organ stilled, and coats fetched. The women clustered near the vestry door, speaking of puddings for the harvest fair. The men lingered outside, lighting pipes beneath the dripping eaves. Someone mentioned that Sister Agnes, the kindly nun who often helped at the church, had promised to bring her special fruit tarts next Sunday. But Sister Agnes did not appear. At first, no one thought much of it. She was a punctual woman, yes, but she might have been delayed by one of her charitable calls. Yet, when Mrs. Price checked the time and frowned, a faint unease spread among the group. It was unlike Sister Agnes to vanish without a word. The road between the convent and the church was short, well lit, and lined with hedgerows. Still, the rain had grown heavier, and concern began to whisper from one villager to another. Miss Marple, wrapping her shawl about her shoulders, listened to the growing murmur. She did not speak, but her blue eyes narrowed slightly. "She left before rehearsal, didn't she?" asked Ruth timidly. "She said she'd fetch the hymn books from the vestry." Mr. Giles nodded, frowning. "And I saw her go through that side door near the churchyard. I thought she was only stepping out for a moment." By 9:30, a small search party had formed. Lanterns were fetched, boots splashed through puddles, and voices called out through the rain. The churchyard yielded nothing, only the wet gleam of headstones and the distant rustle of trees. The path to the convent lay silent. Then came the first cry. It was young Nora who stumbled upon the discarded umbrella lying near the lich gate, its handle cracked, its fabric torn as though it had been wrenched from someone's grasp. A few yards farther, one of the lanterns caught a flash of white cloth at the edge of the hedge, a fragment of veil snagged among the thorns. Within minutes, the vicar's wife had gone pale. Mr. Giles had sent for the constable, and the quiet village night turned uneasy. Miss Marple remained near the gate, her umbrella raised against the rain. Her expression was thoughtful, not frightened. "Strange," she murmured softly to herself. "A torn umbrella, a caught veil, and yet no sign of a struggle upon the path. People often forget," she added, almost absently, "that wickedness can walk most comfortably under a cloak of piety." When Constable Henderson arrived, puffing and red-faced, the villagers were already gathered, their voices overlapping with fear and conjecture. Someone suggested Sister Agnes might have been taken ill and fallen into the brook beyond the hedge. Another swore they'd seen a dark figure loitering near the church earlier that evening. "Perhaps some vagrant," said Mrs. Price anxiously. "You know how dreadful things are in London these days." Miss Marple said nothing. She stood still, watching the way people spoke. How their eyes shifted, who clutched at whom for comfort. To the casual observer, she appeared simply an elderly spinster with knitting needles and a sensible mind. But behind that mild expression, thoughts were quietly arranging themselves, threads of human nature, small inconsistencies, and the faint tremor in the vicar's wife's voice when she mentioned Sister Agnes's tart recipe. By 10 o'clock, the rain had eased, but the search had found nothing more. The villagers dispersed reluctantly, lanterns bobbing along the lanes like dim stars. Miss Marple lingered last, her gaze resting on the broken umbrella. She bent down, examined the splintered handle, and then looked toward the church door, where muddy footprints led inward, one set large and firm, another smaller, lighter, and abruptly cut off. She straightened slowly, her expression unreadable. "Ah," she murmured, "that's very curious indeed." When she finally returned to her cottage at the corner of the lane, the clock was striking 11. She set her umbrella to dry, stirred the fire, and sat down with her knitting once more. Outside, the wind sighed against the window panes, carrying with it the faint echo of the choir's last hymn. By morning, word had spread throughout Mary Mead. Sister Agnes was missing, vanished without a trace after choir practice, and though the village would soon drown in gossip, it was Miss Marple who quietly resolved that something far darker than misadventure had passed beneath the church's ancient roof that night. Morning broke with pewter light that made the cottages along the high street look newly scrubbed, as if the rain had scoured away not merely soot but certainties. By breakfast, the postmistress had told 3 customers that Sister Agnes's umbrella was found near the lich gate, and by 11's it was common knowledge that a scrap of veil had been taken into the vestry and folded with needless ceremony. Some said by Mrs. Price. Miss Marple set on her hat, pinned her shawl, and went to the church. Constable Henderson, stout and conscientious, was already in the churchyard, measuring footprints with a schoolboy's ruler and a sense of occasion. He greeted Miss Marple respectfully. The trodden path, dulled to a clay sheen, showed the firm impressions again. A large boot, rain softened at the edges, and smaller prints that paused. Abruptly at the flagstones before the side door, Henderson muttered about the brook beyond the hedge and spoke of accidents. "People who slip," Miss Marple said gently, "usually try to stand up again. One sees the marks of it." Henderson looked, and to his credit, looked properly. There were no scrapes, no desperate slides, no heel marks clawing for purchase. Instead, there was a neatness, a tidiness that often meant someone had arranged, not suffered, events. He pursed his lips and wrote in his notebook. The organist, Mr. Giles, hovered near the porch with an air of injured dignity. "I should like," Miss Marple murmured, "to see where Sister Agnes left her satchel." "In the vestry cupboard," said Mr. Giles, and led them through the side door, jangling his keys. Inside, the vestry smelled of beeswax and damp paper. On the table, beside the folded veil, lay a hymn list in Sister Agnes's neat rounded hand. Psalm 121, Nunc Dimittis, A. Penciled note tarts Monday which Mrs. Price had underlined. The cupboard yielded the satchel. It contained a rosary, a small purse with 2 shillings and a penny, and a wrapped jar of quince jelly labelled for the vicar's wife. Miss Marple's fingers lingered over the label. The twine was tied in a sailor's knot, a curious choice for a nun whose convent was landlocked, unless someone else had made the knot. She said nothing, only tucked this away with other small curiosities. Back on the path, the village gathered in hesitant constellations. Mrs. Hart from the bakery insisted she had seen Sister Agnes speaking with a gentleman 2 evenings ago, a respectable sort with city polish. Old Mr. Pollard swore he had heard wheels on the lane at 9:30, a motor car too smooth by half. Nora and Ruth, chastened by fear, repeated their fragments for any listener. The umbrella, the veil, the way the organ hummed after the last chord. The vicar arrived late, breathless, and apologetic. And when he took the veil, he held it as a man holds a letter he half wishes to unread. Mrs. Price watched him too closely. Henderson, eager for something practical, proposed questioning the convent. Miss Marple approved and then asked, almost as an afterthought, whether Sister Agnes had enemies. Enemies? Mrs. Price repeated, shocked. In Marymead? In any village, Miss Marple said. Kindness can be a very sharp mirror. She looked toward the hedge where the veil had snagged. A small piece of twine, pale and wet, lay caught in the thorns. She bent and snipped it free with her garden scissors. From a parcel, she observed mildly. Or from a bundle tied in haste. Henderson pocketed the twine soberly. Overhead the bells sounded the hour, and in their measured patience Miss Marple heard the village gird itself for what it would rather not know. The rain had left the air bright. On the flagstones a faint smear of quince jelly gleamed, no bigger than a thumbnail. Miss Marple paused to take in the smear, the knot she had noticed, and the silence that fell when the vicar looked at Mrs. Price. Then she smiled as if at nothing at all and asked who, in a parish of thrift, had twine to spare on a Monday. Someone answered too quickly, and Henderson, pencil poised, missed the flinch that Miss Marple noted quietly. By afternoon the grey clouds had scattered, leaving the village bathed in that deceptive calm that always follows disturbance. Yet beneath the routine of teapots and tidied gardens, an unease rippled. Miss Marple walked the lane toward the convent, her small umbrella tapping the ground with a quiet rhythm. To anyone watching, she was simply a kindly old lady paying a social call. But her mind, neat and methodical, was threading each tiny detail into its place. Sister Agnes's satchel untouched, the twine, the smear of quince jelly, these were not random, they were human fingerprints of intent. Faint, yet distinct to those who had spent a lifetime noticing how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. The convent stood beyond the orchard, its stone walls darkened by age and ivy. Sister Beatrice, a tall woman with narrow eyes and calm hands, received Miss Marple at the gate. Her manner was courteous but guarded, as though the mere mention of Sister Agnes's name required a prayer for discretion. "We have been praying for her safe return," Sister Beatrice said softly. "The police were here this morning." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and I imagine they were very thorough about doors and windows, but not about human hearts. I was wondering, did Sister Agnes seem troubled of late?" There was the faintest hesitation. She was preoccupied. But that is not unusual in our work. She had been visiting Mrs. Price rather often these past weeks, helping with the harvest fair arrangements. Miss Marple inclined her head. So thoughtful of her. And did she ever mention receiving visitors from outside the parish? "Visitors?" Sister Beatrice frowned. "Only a letter, I believe, from someone in London." The old lady's eyes brightened slightly. "A letter? How curious. May I ask who it was from?" Sister Beatrice's tone turned careful. She did not say. I recall only that she seemed startled when it arrived, though afterward she smiled and said it was nothing at all. They spoke a little longer of faith, of choir practice, of the small goodnesses that made up Sister Agnes's life. And when Miss Marple took her leave, her mind was already arranging the pattern. A letter from London, a sudden disappearance, a jar of quince jelly labelled for Mrs. Price, and that sailor's knot. Nothing fit the image of a saintly nun walking home after a hymn. Everything whispered of deception disguised as duty. On her way back through the village, she met young Nora outside the bakery. The girl looked pale and flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began breathlessly. "Constable Henderson says they're dragging the brook now. He thinks Sister Agnes must have fallen." "Do they indeed?" Miss Marple said mildly. "But the brook, dear, runs downhill. If she had fallen in near the hedge, the water would have carried her toward the mill, and yet no one there saw a thing. Mr. Giles said she might have gone willingly, that perhaps she left to join another order." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured, eyes twinkling faintly. "People often prefer a comforting story to an uncomfortable truth. It's a trait one notices in choir rehearsals as well as crimes." She thanked the girl kindly and continued toward the church. A cart rattled past, driven by the village carpenter, who touched his cap in greeting. Miss Marple noticed the coil of twine on his seat, thick, coarse, and identical to the piece she had found near the hedge. Her gaze lingered, but she said nothing. Instead, she stopped by the church gate, where Henderson and the vicar stood in hushed conversation. "No sign of her in the brook," the constable said when she approached. "We'll widen the search. The inspector's coming down from Melchester tomorrow." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "You've done quite right, I'm sure. Though sometimes, constable, when one looks too far afield, one overlooks what is close at hand." The vicar's face was grey with worry. "She was so good, Miss Marple. Always helping my wife, always smiling." "Goodness," said Miss Marple quietly, "can sometimes be the very cloak under which guilt hides most comfortably. But tell me, was it Sister Agnes who suggested the idea of the Harvest Fair raffle?" "Yes, indeed," the vicar replied. "She said the proceeds would go to the orphanage fund." My wife was delighted. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And did anyone else handle the funds?" "Mrs. Price kept the envelopes," he said, a little uncertainly. "But it was Sister Agnes who insisted they be locked in the vestry safe after choir practice each week." "How very sensible," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "And how very convenient, too." As she turned toward home, the evening shadows stretched across the lane, long and crooked like the lines of a riddle half solved. The village would dine and gossip, Henderson would write his reports, and the brook would whisper over stones as if nothing were amiss. Yet Miss Marple knew that somewhere among them someone had counted too much on appearances, and she meant to discover precisely who that someone was. By the following morning, the village was alive with theories, each more elaborate than the last. The butcher's wife was certain Sister Agnes had been called away by her order in secret. The postmistress insisted she had eloped, though with whom she could not say, and Mrs. Price had taken to speaking in hushed tones of sinister outsiders, which caused quite a stir among the church ladies. Through it all, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, poring over a pot of tea and knitting steadily, her thoughts far from wool. There was a pattern here. She could feel it. It was like a half-finished lace doily, an absence that formed meaning only when one looked at what was missing. The jar of quince jelly, the twine, the raffle money. The letter from London, they were all loose stitches in a hidden design. And people, Miss Marple thought, were much like her knitting. Pull one wrong thread, and everything unraveled. By mid-morning, Constable Henderson appeared at her gate, hat in hand, looking troubled. "We've had a report, Miss Marple," he said. "Mr. Pollard found something by the old mill pond." His voice wavered slightly on the last word. Miss Marple set aside her knitting at once. "Then we had best go, hadn't we?" she said simply, and fetched her coat. The pond lay just beyond the orchard, a still, murky mirror beneath, drooping willows. Several villagers had gathered, whispering behind gloved hands. Henderson stepped carefully along the bank, pointing toward a patch of reeds where a white shape lay half submerged. Miss Marple's eyes followed his gesture, and her breath caught not from shock, but from the terrible stillness of recognition. They pulled her gently from the water. Sister Agnes's face, though pale and softened by the current, retained its quiet dignity. Her rosary was tangled in her fingers, but the beads were broken halfway through, as if snapped in sudden violence. Henderson crossed himself awkwardly. "Poor soul," he murmured. "There'll be talk, of course, but the doctor will say she drowned." Miss Marple's gaze swept the body. The veil was missing, torn away, perhaps the same scrap found near the hedge. Her shoes were scuffed, and the hem of her habit was smeared with something sticky, faintly pinkish. She stooped, touched it lightly, and then straightened with a small nod. "Quince jelly," she said softly. Henderson looked baffled. "Jelly, ma'am?" "Yes, Constable. I imagine she carried it with her to the vestry. There must have been 2 jars, one for the vicar's wife, the other perhaps intended elsewhere." Her voice was quiet but sure. "You see, It's seldom the large things that reveal a crime, it's the small domestic oddities. The doctor arrived soon after, flustered and sweating, declaring it an unfortunate accident. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the faint bruising on Sister Agnes's wrist, finger-shaped, deliberate. She said nothing then, merely thanked the constable and walked back toward the church. Her mind, however, moved swiftly. At the vestry, she found Mrs. Price arranging flowers, her expression suitably mournful yet tinged with the satisfaction of being at the center of village attention. Such a tragedy, Mrs. Price sighed. And to think she was here only hours before it happened. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, indeed. And you must have spoken with her just before she left? Why, yes. She came to fetch the hymn sheets. We chatted briefly about the raffle envelopes. She was most insistent they be locked away at once. Such a conscientious woman. Quite, Miss Marple said gently, her eyes drifting to the drawer of the vestry table. And no one else entered after she did? Mrs. Price hesitated. Only my husband. For a moment, he was looking for the offertory box key. Miss Marple inclined her head. I see. Curious, though, isn't it? How easily two people might have met unseen in this very room. The door to the church stands ajar, the side entrance hidden by the hedge. She turned toward the window, her voice casual. A perfect place for a brief exchange and for something to go terribly wrong. Mrs. Price's composure flickered, only for a heartbeat, but Miss Marple saw it. Fear, or guilt, or both, it was hard to say. As she stepped outside, the church bells began to toll softly, their sound floating through the still air. She looked toward the lich gate, where the broken umbrella still leaned forgotten against the wall, and thought again of the knot on the quince jar, tied by a sailor's hand. And then she remembered. The carpenter, with twine on his cart, and his brother, long ago a merchant seaman. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her heart heavy but her mind sharpening. Death seldom entered Mary Mead uninvited, she thought, and when it did, it always wore a familiar face. That evening, a hush fell over Mary Mead, a hush thicker than grief, laced with suspicion. Lamps glowed dimly behind curtained windows, and the murmurs of villagers carried like wind through hedgerows. Everyone spoke of Sister Agnes now, but none quite the same way twice. Some swore it was an accident, others whispered of darker things, and a few already hinted at scandal. Miss Marple listened to none of it directly, but she heard all the same. In a village like Mary Mead, rumor had a voice of its own, and it never lied outright. It only rearranged the truth. She sat by her hearth that night, knitting untouched upon her lap. Her mind wandered through the day's events, sorting them as she might sort buttons by size, shape, and where they had come undone. Sister Agnes had died in the brook, but her body had been placed in the pond. That much she was nearly sure of. The brook ran too shallow to drown a grown woman unless she were unconscious first, and even then there would have been traces of a struggle. Mud upon her hands, torn reeds. But the nun's hands were clean, her nails smooth, her expression oddly serene. It was not drowning she had feared, it was the person who stood before her. A knock sounded at the door. It was Mr. Giles, the choirmaster, his tall frame awkward in the doorway. "Forgive me, Miss Marple," he began, wringing his cap. "I thought perhaps you might want to hear, well, something that's troubling me." "Do come in, Mr. Giles," she said kindly. A troubling conscience should never be left out in the cold. He sat gingerly, twisting his hat in his hands. "It's about the raffle. You see, Sister Agnes asked me to make sure the tickets were numbered properly, but when I looked last week, there were fewer envelopes than there should have been. I told Mrs. Price, of course. But, she said, Sister Agnes must have miscounted. Only now, after what's happened." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. "You wonder if perhaps the miscount was not an error at all." He nodded miserably. "There was money missing, I think. Not much, but enough. I didn't want to believe it. She was such a good soul." "Good souls," Miss Marple murmured, are sometimes the first to be deceived. It's their nature to trust. He looked puzzled, but she only smiled and sent him on his way. When the door closed, her expression changed entirely. She rose, set her shawl about her shoulders, and stepped out into the night. The air was cool and sharp. The moon rode high over the church spire, silvering the cobblestones. She moved quietly along the lane, her small figure blending with the shadows. At the vestry door, she paused. It was locked, as it should be, yet there were faint scratches near the keyhole, fresh ones. Someone had tried to open it again since the police had left. She examined the handle with care, noting a thin smear of something dark and sticky. Quince jelly again. She took out her handkerchief, dabbed it delicately, and tucked it away. A sound startled her, a faint creak from within the church. She waited, heart steady, listening. Then she saw it, a sliver of light moving between the pews. Someone was inside. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows as the vestry door opened slightly. A figure slipped out, a woman in a dark cloak, moving quickly toward the path that led behind the churchyard. For an instant, the moon caught her face. It was Mrs. Price. Miss Marple did not follow at once. Instead, she went into the church and lit a candle. The vestry cupboard hung ajar. Inside, the envelopes from the raffle were scattered, a few torn open. She picked one up. It was empty, but bore traces of damp and sugar along the edge, as if it had once held something other than paper. A clever hiding place, she thought. Money, or letters, or something meant to pass unseen, and someone had found it worth killing for. When she stepped outside again, the lane was empty. Only the echo of hurried footsteps lingered, fading toward the convent road. Miss Marple extinguished her candle, her expression serene but her mind alight with clarity. The pattern had begun to take shape at last. The key was not the missing nun, nor the stolen envelopes. It was the quince jelly, sweet and harmless on the tongue, but sticky enough to trap the careless hand that made use of it. Human nature, she murmured softly, is the stickiest substance of all. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the post office with deliberate calm. The village appeared outwardly peaceful. Children in neat coats trudged to school. Mrs. Hart arranged bread rolls behind her window, but that calm was brittle, like a teacup hiding a crack. The previous night's discovery in the vestry had stirred something dangerous beneath the surface. She suspected that the person who returned to the church after dark would not rest easily now. A murderer, after all, is not merely wicked. They are nervous, forever afraid that their cleverness might betray them. She stopped at the postmistress's counter, buying 2 stamps she did not need, and casually asked, "I heard there was some post from London not long ago." Miss Larkins, whose gossip was both thorough and involuntary, brightened at once. "Oh yes, one for Sister Agnes, wasn't it? Came about a week ago. Fine, paper, foreign mark, looked important. But she came for it herself, so I can't say from whom. Funny thing, though, the return address was smudged, looked almost as if someone had wiped it away." Miss Marple thanked her kindly and left, thinking of the letter that had startled Sister Agnes and the smudged return mark. Someone had not wished that correspondence to be traced, and if that someone had later needed to recover it from the vestry cupboard, well, murder had been committed for smaller motives. On her way back, she paused outside the carpenter's workshop. The door was open, the sound of sawing steady within. Mr. Reeves looked up from his bench with a polite nod. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Mr. Reeves. I was admiring your handiwork on the new pews. Such neat work. I noticed you use quite a bit of that strong twine for binding before finishing the edges." He smiled modestly. "Old habit, ma'am. My brother taught me when he came back from sea. Sailors' knots never fail, you know." "I'm sure they don't," she said gently. "And you lent some of that twine recently, didn't you? To Mrs. Price?" "Perhaps." He blinked, surprised. "Why, yes, how did you know that?" "She came by last Monday for a few lengths. Said she was tying packages for the church raffle." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. So she did. She thanked him and walked on, her thoughts quickening. Monday. The same day the jelly jars had been sealed, the raffle envelopes arranged, and the letter perhaps hidden. Mrs. Price had borrowed the twine to tie the packages, but had she tied only those? By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, Constable Henderson was waiting outside, hat in hand as usual. "I've been up to the convent again," he said. "Sister Beatrice showed me the room. Seems Sister Agnes kept a little box locked in her drawer. They found the key in her rosary pouch, but the box was empty. Empty. Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her eyes sharpened. How very interesting. Did Sister Beatrice mention what had been inside? Only papers, she said, letters mostly. She thought they were from the orphanage she'd worked at in London, but none of them were there. Miss Marple stood very still. A nun with a secret letter, a raffle gone astray, a woman borrowing twine to tie more than packages, and a body moved to the pond, all neatly layered, like the folds of a hymn sheet hiding something unholy beneath. "Constable," she said after a moment, "it might be wise to keep an eye on Mrs. Price this afternoon. I fancy she may pay a visit to the vicarage garden. People who feel guilt often find fresh air very necessary." Henderson frowned, uncertain. "Do you think she?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think nothing yet. But human nature, Constable, is a curious thing. It dislikes unfinished business." That evening, as twilight crept through the lanes, Miss Marple positioned herself near her garden gate, pretending to fuss with the roses. Sure enough, just after the vesper bells, a figure in a dark coat hurried down the lane toward the vicarage. Mrs. Price moved quickly, glancing behind her once, carrying something small wrapped in a handkerchief. She knelt by the lilac bushes, dug a little at the soil with a trowel, and slipped the object into the earth. Miss Marple watched silently until the woman departed, then crossed the road and stooped by the disturbed patch. Her fingers brushed against metal, a small tin box, still damp from the soil. Inside lay several folded letters, tied neatly with a piece of twine in a sailor's knot. The topmost sheet bore the convent seal, but beneath it, half hidden, was another. A man's handwriting, bold and unmistakably not clerical. Miss Marple's lips tightened. "Oh dear," she whispered to herself. "I fear the good Sister Agnes was not the only one keeping a secret from the parish." She slipped the box into her shawl and walked home, the bells echoing softly behind her. The net was tightening now, and somewhere among those letters lay the truth, sweet, sticky, and dangerous, just like the quince jelly that had started it all. The next morning dawned pale and cold, the kind of morning when sound seemed to travel farther in the still air. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the small tin box before her on the table. She had already boiled water for tea, though she had yet to pour it. Her eyes lingered on the letters tied within the sailor's knot. The handwriting on the top sheet, firm and masculine, belonged not to any villager she knew, but she had seen something similar once, years ago, on a parcel sent to Mrs. Price. She untied the twine carefully, her fingers steady, and began to read. The first letter was simple enough, a formal tone, full of polite gratitude and reminders of past service. It was signed A. Whitby, a name that meant nothing to her at first. But the second and third were less polite. They hinted at money owed, at promises broken, and at a meeting to settle matters before the fair. There was something desperate about them, pleading cloaked in civility. And then, folded among them, a smaller note in Sister Agnes's handwriting. "Your demands are unjust. I will speak to Mrs. Price if you persist. I cannot and will not sin again for your sake." Miss Marple exhaled softly. The words, "sin again," caught her attention. So there had been something before, a transgression, perhaps forgiven by faith but not forgotten by those who had profited from it. She replaced the letters and rewrapped the box, mind moving like clockwork. The missing raffle funds, the borrowed twine, the letter from London. It was no longer a tangle of coincidence. It was the outline of a quiet blackmail, one that had grown dangerous when conscience awoke too late. By mid-morning, she walked to the vicarage, the box hidden beneath her shawl. Mrs. Price was in the drawing room arranging lilies, her face composed but her hands trembling ever so slightly. "My dear Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said gently, "what a comfort flowers are in times of sorrow, though lilies, of course, are often associated with confession." Mrs. Price turned sharply, color draining from her cheeks. "Confession? I'm not sure I understand." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, forgive me. I've been thinking about poor Sister Agnes, such a charitable woman, and yet I imagine she bore a heavy burden. It must be dreadful to live with a secret one cannot share." The other woman's eyes flickered, just for an instant, toward the window. "We all have burdens, Miss Marple. Some best left unspoken." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "especially when silence might protect the living at the expense of the dead." She laid the tin box on the table. "I believe this belongs to you." Mrs. Price froze. Her fingers gripped the balanced edge of the vase, and for a moment Miss Marple feared she might faint. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "From the vicarage garden," Miss Marple said softly. "Such good soil for flowers, though, I dare say, less suitable for secrets. I did not read all of them, you know. Only enough to understand that Sister Agnes's death was not heaven's doing." Mrs. Price's composure cracked like thin ice. She sank into a chair, clutching at her handkerchief. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said hoarsely. "You must believe that. I only wanted to frighten her. She threatened to tell my husband. The money wasn't mine. It was my brother's. He lost his position in London and begged for help. Sister Agnes promised to keep it quiet, but when she spoke of going to the police, her voice broke. She came to the vestry that night to demand the letters back. I tried to stop her. She slipped her head, struck the stone by the door. There was blood, and I panicked. I thought if she were found near the pond, it might look like an accident." Miss Marple listened without interruption. Her expression was neither accusing nor kind, only deeply, painfully understanding. "And the quince jelly?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Price stared at her. "It spilled when I moved her. I wiped it with my handkerchief. It was so foolish, but I thought no one would notice." Miss Marple nodded. "People seldom notice the ordinary. That is why it so often tells the truth." For a long moment, the two women sat in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. At last, Miss Marple rose. "You will, of course, tell the constable everything. It is better so. Secrets have a way of curdling, rather like preserves left too long in the jar." Mrs. Price wept softly as Miss Marple left, her tears falling into the lilies she had so carefully arranged. Outside, the air was crisp and still. The church bell tolled noon, echoing across the green. And Miss Marple paused by the gate, her eyes lifted toward the quiet spire. Human frailty, she thought, was as old as sin itself, and just as predictable. Yet even in the smallest of villages, it still found ways to astonish her. The news of Mrs. Price's confession spread through Mary Mead, not in words, but in atmosphere. By the next morning, the village moved as though beneath a veil people spoke more softly, walked more carefully, and avoided looking one another too directly. It was not guilt, precisely, but the unease that comes when an illusion of goodness has been broken. The vicar cancelled choir practice, the constable spent most of the day taking statements, and the church bells that had tolled for Sister Agnes now hung mute, as though unwilling to sound in judgment. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had spent the morning in her garden, trimming roses that had long since given up blooming. It was a task she did not need to do, but one that helped her think. The police were satisfied. They had their culprit, a confession, and a plausible explanation. Yet something in it troubled her. Not the act itself, people could do dreadful things when cornered, but the untidiness of the story. Mrs. Price's account had been too neat, her remorse too practiced, as though she were confessing to the wrong sin to hide the right one. By noon, Miss Marple had resolved to see the matter properly finished. She walked to the vicarage, her small frame casting a short, crisp shadow along the lane. The constable was just leaving, looking flushed and triumphant. "All settled, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully. "Mrs. Price is to be taken to Melchester this afternoon. Tragic business, but she's made it easier for everyone by owning up." "How very helpful of her," Miss Marple murmured. "Though I dare say, Constable, that human nature rarely behaves so conveniently. You might keep an open mind, just for a few hours longer." He blinked at her, confused, but she only smiled her vague, grandmotherly smile and went on toward the house. Inside, the vicar sat at his desk, head bowed, the faint tremor in his hands betraying a grief that was not purely spiritual. "I can hardly believe it," he said when she entered. "My wife, my own wife, responsible for such a thing. How could she bear it? All these weeks, speaking with such calm, hosting the fair, arranging the hymns." "Guilt wears many faces, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes it looks like composure, sometimes like kindness. But tell me, did you yourself ever see these letters that she mentioned? The ones she said Sister Agnes used for blackmail?" He frowned. "No, never. I didn't even know they existed until this morning. She said they were personal. That Sister Agnes had learned of some impropriety involving money, and she feared exposure." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "but impropriety and sin are not always the same. One embarrasses the body, the other stains the soul." She left him to his grief and made her way to the church once more. The vestry was locked, but Henderson, at her polite insistence, lent her the key. Inside, the air was still cool, scented faintly of candle wax and lilies left too long in the vase. She walked slowly, her eyes roaming across the room, pausing where memory tugged. The table where the quince jelly had stood. The cupboard door that hung just slightly askew. And there, upon the edge of the wooden floorboard, a faint reddish stain, half cleaned, half hidden beneath polish. She knelt, running a finger lightly across it. Sticky. Recent. The very same jelly she had noticed days ago, but that was impossible, wasn't it? Mrs. Price had confessed to wiping it away after moving the body. Why then was there a newer trace here, days later, when the vestry had been closed to everyone but the constable and the vicar? Miss Marple stood very still. Her mind, so accustomed to finding order in disorder, began arranging the facts once more. Sister Agnes's letters had not been addressed to Mrs. Price, but to someone she trusted, someone who had cause to fear exposure. The writing, A. Whitby, yes, that name was familiar. Not from the village, but from a sermon she had heard months before. The vicar had spoken fondly of a man named Andrew Whitby, an old friend from London who had assisted in certain charitable accounts. It was then she understood. The money from the raffle, the supposed blackmail, the borrowed twine, all threads in a design that had never belonged to Mrs. Price at all. The poor woman had merely played her part, guided by someone clever enough to let her believe the guilt was hers. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned quietly to the vicarage, where the constable was preparing his papers. "Just one small matter, Mr. Henderson," she said pleasantly. "Before you depart with Mrs. Price, might I have a look at the letters again?" He hesitated, but obliged, retrieving the tin box. Miss Marple untied the twine and withdrew the topmost sheet. "You see," she said mildly, "this signature, A. Whitby. It isn't a name one often forgets, but if one looks closely here, the crossing of the T, the slant of the Y, it's the very same as the vicar's handwriting on last Sunday's notice board." Henderson leaned in, eyes widening. "You mean?" "I mean," Miss Marple said softly, "that Sister Agnes discovered the misappropriation of church funds not by Mrs. Price, but by her husband. She confronted him in the vestry that night. The poor woman came later, perhaps she saw the body, perhaps she was persuaded to help move it. Either way, she took the blame, as loyal wives so often do. The vicar's shock this morning, I dare say, was as much relief as remorse." At that moment, the vicar appeared in the doorway, pale as chalk. He had heard everything. For a long, terrible silence, only the clock ticked. Then, he sank into the nearest chair, covering his face with his hands. "It was never meant to happen," he whispered. "She accused me, threatened to tell the bishop. I only meant to stop her, to silence her for a moment, but she fell. I panicked. My wife, God forgive her, helped me carry her to the pond. She said it would look like an accident. I let her believe she'd saved me, and in doing so, she condemned herself." The constable stood frozen, his pen hanging uselessly above his notes. Miss Marple, her expression grave but not unkind, laid a hand upon the vicar's arm. "You have both borne enough deceit, Mr. Price. Truth, though painful, is the only thing left to give her peace, and perhaps in time, your own." When the constable led him away, the bells began to toll once more, not for celebration, but for the end of illusion. Miss Marple walked home through the dusk, her figure small and calm against the fading light. Evil, she reflected, was seldom loud or monstrous. It most often whispered, wore a collar, and spoke gently from the pulpit. By the time she reached her cottage, night had fallen, and the roses she had trimmed that morning glistened in the moonlight like drops of glass. She closed her door quietly behind her, set the kettle to boil, and at last allowed herself a sigh of sadness, yes, but also of weary satisfaction. The pattern, at last, was complete. The following days passed in a quiet melancholy that settled like fog over Mary Mead. The vicarage curtains remained drawn, the church doors locked, and the lanes uncharacteristically silent. The villagers spoke in half-whispers when they met by the post office or the green, glancing about before lowering their voices to remark how terribly sad it all was. Some expressed pity for Mrs. Price, others shook their heads over the vicar's fall from grace, but all agreed that wickedness had crept into their peaceful village and left an indelible stain. Miss Marple, for her part, said little. She went about her modest routines, tending her garden, visiting the baker, and answering those who sought her company with the same gentle courtesy she always displayed. Yet those who knew her well might have noticed that her knitting needles rested more often than they moved, and that her gaze, when it wandered, always returned to the church tower. It was not satisfaction that occupied her thoughts, it was sorrow. She had seen guilt before, in many forms and many faces. But what troubled her most was not the vicar's crime. It was the quiet complicity of a woman who had loved too deeply to question evil when it wore familiar hands. Mrs. Price had acted out of devotion, not malice, and Miss Marple knew that such devotion, once corrupted, was far more dangerous than hatred. On the third morning after the arrest, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Constable Henderson, looking uncharacteristically subdued. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Sorry to trouble you again." "Not at all, Constable. Do come in. You look as though the weather's turned against you, though I dare say it's not the rain that's dampened your spirits." He removed his hat, twisting it in his hands. "You're right there, ma'am. There's something not sitting right with me about the whole business. The inspector from Melchester, he's satisfied enough, but I've been going through the vicar's papers. There's something odd." "Odd, you say? Sit down, my dear, and tell me everything." Henderson cleared his throat. "Well, you see, among his ledgers, there's a letter from the bishop's office dated 3 months ago. It's about the orphanage funds Sister Agnes was managing. Turns out the bishop had already approved a transfer signed by both Sister Agnes and the vicar himself. No missing money at all. Every penny accounted for, so if she had found irregularities, they weren't in the church's accounts." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "How very curious. Then her threat could not have been about the church's finances. Tell me, Constable, were there any personal papers among his things? Private correspondence?" He nodded. "A few. Some from London, 1 or 2 from a Reverend Whitby, perhaps a relative of the name on the letters you found. But there's one more thing. The postmistress said a man came looking for the vicar the night after the murder, claimed to be a friend from his old parish in Paddington, asked if he'd gone away unexpectedly. No one's seen him since. Miss Marple sat back, her fingers lightly touching her teacup, but her thoughts moving elsewhere. Paddington, London, and a Reverend Whitby. Yes. That aligns quite neatly, doesn't it? Only I suspect this visitor was not a reverend at all. She rose and walked to the window, looking out across the village green where the trees swayed gently in the autumn wind. Constable, I think it is time we pay a small visit to the convent once more. An hour later, they stood before Sister Beatrice, who regarded them with quiet composure. Such a tragedy, she murmured, folding her hands. Poor Sister Agnes, her goodness led her straight into danger. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed. Tell me, sister, was she ever in correspondence with a man named Andrew Whitby? The nun's expression did not change, but her voice softened. Mr. Whitby was a benefactor. He once managed funds for the orphanage before he lost his position. He was devoted to our work, but his methods were, shall we say, worldly. Sister Agnes felt it her duty to sever contact after rumors arose that he had misused donations. And did she speak of him recently? A week before her death, she told me she had heard from him again. He begged forgiveness, said he wished to make amends. She meant to meet him privately to discuss restitution. I warned her, of course, that men who come seeking absolution sometimes bring more sin than sorrow. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And this meeting was it to take place here? No, Sister Beatrice said quietly. She was to meet him at the church after choir practice. It seems she never returned. Outside, Henderson's face was grim. So there was another party involved, a man. If that's true, Mrs. Price's confession was an act of desperation. Miss Marple finished. Her husband's death sentence has already been sealed in reputation, if not yet in law. But the real serpent in the garden, Constable, was never inside the vicarage. It came from London. That evening, as dusk fell and mist crept over the churchyard, Miss Marple sat by her fire, a letter in her lap, addressed to Inspector Cray at Melchester. She had written it carefully, each line factual yet understated, suggesting that the man known as Andrew Whitby, believed dead, perhaps even using another name, might have been seen near Mary Mead on the night of Sister Agnes's death. She described his likely motive. The nun had uncovered his embezzlement of charitable funds years ago, and her intention to expose him once more threatened his freedom. The vicar's weakness, his connection to Whitby, had made him the perfect scapegoat. When she sealed the letter, she allowed herself a small sigh. The human heart, she thought, was a treacherous place, capable of both loyalty and ruin in the same beat. Poor Mrs. Price had been the unwitting shield of a guilt not her own, her husband's downfall merely the second act in a drama staged long before the choir's final hymn. 2 days later, the telegram arrived. Whitby apprehended in Paddington lodging, confessed, Price exonerated. Deep gratitude. Cray. Miss Marple set it down, her expression calm, though her eyes shone with quiet satisfaction. Justice had been done, though it had taken the gentle persistence of truth to reveal it. That Sunday, the church reopened. The villagers filled the pews again, subdued but grateful, their voices blending timidly through the familiar hymns. Miss Marple sat near the back, knitting in her lap, her gaze wandering to the sunlight filtering through the stained glass. The melody rose, faltering at first, then steady as the organ played the same hymn Sister Agnes had rehearsed on her final evening. When the service ended, Miss Marple stepped out into the bright, cold morning. The world, she thought, had an extraordinary way of returning to order, though the traces of wrongdoing never entirely vanished. Evil might be buried beneath politeness and prayer, but it always left a faint mark like the lingering sweetness of quince jelly upon the air, impossible to mistake once one had noticed it. And as she walked back toward her cottage, the village alive again with cautious laughter and clattering teacups, Miss Marple reflected, with her gentle smile, that perhaps it was mercy itself that made human nature so endlessly worth observing. The winter sun hung low over Mary Mead, washing the village in a pale, forgiving light that softened the edges of things, rooftops, fences, and even memories. The scandal had begun to fade, as all village scandals do, absorbed into the rhythm of daily life. The vicarage had new curtains and a caretaker from Melchester sent by the diocese, and though the church bells once more marked the hours, they rang with a quieter note, as if the air itself remembered. Yet for Miss Marple, the matter was not so neatly folded away. Crimes, she knew, seldom ended when the guilty were caught. Their consequences lingered like smoke in drapery, faint, but never quite gone. She sat by her hearth that afternoon, a letter from Inspector Cray resting on her lap. It confirmed the arrest and confession of Andrew Whitby, who had admitted to confronting Sister Agnes in the vestry under the pretense of reconciliation. When she refused his plea for silence, he struck her, in panic, killing her instantly. He had then fled through the churchyard, leaving the vicar to discover the body later and make his fatal choice to move it, conceal it, and shield his wife from a truth she could not have borne. Whitby, the inspector wrote, had been a man of intellect corrupted by self-preservation and had shown no remorse save for his own exposure. Miss Marple folded the letter neatly, her eyes distant. There was no satisfaction in such conclusions. She had long ceased expecting justice to feel tidy. She rose, poured herself a cup of tea, and glanced toward the lane outside her window. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the hedgerows with silver. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and frost clean, but with the echo of something lost. A knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, she found young Nora Fielding standing there, bundled in a thick scarf, her eyes wide with the solemnity of one who has seen too much of the adult world too soon. "Miss Marple," she said shyly, "Mum sent me with scones. She said you've not been at the post office tea for days." Miss Marple smiled warmly, taking the basket. "How thoughtful of your mother, and of you, my dear. Won't you come in a moment? It's bitter cold, and I dare say a cup of cocoa might keep the frost from settling in your nose." Nora giggled, stepped inside, and perched by the fire as Miss Marple prepared the cocoa. The girls' chatter, once the careless music of youth, had softened since the tragedy. After a few moments, she looked up suddenly and asked, "Is it really all over now? About Sister Agnes, I mean. Mummy says bad people always get what's coming to them, but I heard Mrs. Hart say the vicar wasn't bad at all, just weak. Is that the same thing?" Miss Marple paused, stirring the pot thoughtfully. "Not quite the same, my dear. Weakness can be a dreadful thing, but it's not wickedness. Wickedness knows exactly what it does. Weakness simply closes its eyes and hopes not to see." Nora frowned, thinking deeply. "Then, people can do wrong without meaning to?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple gently, handing her the cup. "They do it every day, sometimes out of love, sometimes out of fear. That is what makes life so very complicated." When the girl left, Miss Marple returned to her chair and stared into the flames. Nora's innocent question had touched something in her that never quite hardened despite all she had seen. The tragedy had begun with charity and ended with confession, a circle of well-intentioned deeds gone sour. Sister Agnes had wanted to protect an orphanage. Mrs. Price had wanted to protect her husband. The vicar had wanted to protect his wife. And Whitby, in some warped fashion, had wanted to protect his own comfort. Everyone had been protecting something, and yet no one had protected the truth. Late that evening, the constable called once more, his boots leaving wet prints on her doorstep. He looked apologetic, hat in hand. "Evening, Miss Marple. I thought you'd want to know. They've taken Whitby up to London. He'll be tried in the spring, though the doctor says his health is failing fast. Might not see Easter." She nodded slowly. "It often happens that way. Evil wears a brave face until it's unmasked, then it crumbles under its own weight." He hesitated. "There's something else. Mrs. Price. She's gone to stay with her sister in Devon. Left yesterday morning. Said she couldn't bear the sight of the church. I suppose one can't blame her. No, Miss Marple said softly. One can only pity her. She lived by the vicar's conscience, not her own. That is a most fragile sort of faith. When he left, she stood for a long while at the window, watching the snow settle over the churchyard. The graves looked peaceful, untouched by the whispers that clung to the living. Beyond the wall, the faint glow of the vicarage lamp flickered. Someone new would soon take his place, preach sermons of forgiveness to those who longed to hear them. Life would go on, as it always did, but the village, Miss Marple thought, would not forget so quickly. Mary Mead had a long memory for tragedy, particularly the kind that grew from its own soil. A few days later, she received a visit from the bishop's secretary, a thin, courteous man who thanked her profusely on behalf of the diocese for her invaluable discernment. Miss Marple listened patiently, offering tea and refusing praise. I merely noticed what others overlooked, she said mildly. One sees so much by simply sitting still. Before he left, he mentioned that the convent would be establishing a small memorial for Sister Agnes near the churchyard gate, a new rose bed, to bloom each spring as a symbol of renewal. They thought it fitting, he said, that someone who devoted her life to nurture should be remembered with living beauty. After he departed, Miss Marple decided to walk there herself. The path was quiet, muffled by snow. She stopped at the gate, brushing frost from the lichstone. The air held that peculiar stillness that comes before twilight. She could almost hear the faint echo of voices from that night, the choir's harmonies, the sound of rain on stone, and the momentary hush that had followed Sister Agnes's disappearance. All of it felt at once distant and vividly present, as though time itself had folded, letting memory breathe again. She knelt briefly by the ground where the new roses would soon be planted, and whispered, "Poor child, you meant well, and that is both your glory and your undoing." Then she stood, straightened her shawl, and turned toward home. At her gate, she found Mrs. Hart waiting, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Ah, Miss Marple, I thought I might catch you. We're having a small gathering tomorrow evening, just tea and cake, nothing formal. I do hope you'll come. Everyone's saying how nice it will be to have something cheerful again." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very pleasant. Yes, I think I shall." That night, she sat once more by the fire, the warmth flickering across her face. The village clock chimed 9, steady and familiar. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing footprints, smoothing paths, concealing the uneven ground of human frailty beneath its perfect white blanket. Miss Marple, watching the quiet world beyond her window, thought how lovely it looked and how deceptive. She reached for her knitting, though her mind was still far from her wool. Somewhere, faintly, she imagined she heard the choir again, the gentle hum of voices blending in perfect harmony. But she knew, as she always did, that harmony was an illusion created by balance, not purity. For every note that rang true, another trembled beneath it, fragile and uncertain. As the fire burned low, she folded her knitting neatly and prepared for bed. Village, she reflected, would heal. New gossip would come, new visitors. Perhaps even another mystery human nature was obliging that way. Yet she felt, with a touch of melancholy, that each case she solved left behind not triumph but understanding. Understanding of how easily goodness could twist, how quickly kindness could turn to concealment, and how even the gentlest hearts could harbor the seeds of ruin. The wind sighed against the window pane, soft and almost sorrowful. Miss Marple extinguished her lamp, whispering as she always did before sleep, "God forgive us all our small deceits." And as the snow drifted soundlessly across Mary Mead, the church bell tolled once low, deliberate and final, as though the night itself had closed the last page on Sister Agnes's story.